Sedíme na legendárnom Majdane. Tuto za mnou je hotel Ukrajina.
We are now sitting in the legendary Independence Square. Behind me is a Ukraina hotel, and I came down here, a street with many memorials, commemorating those who died at Maidan events 4 years ago. Even after 4 years, and even for me, as a Slovak, these emotions are still intense. Next to me, there is a person who was actively involved at Maidan. My question is, are these emotions over for you?
No. And I don't know if I ever be over it. Not just me, but many other people too. First of all, because those who are guilty are still not punished. Those who ordered the others to kill people. And secondly, you know that after Maidan, the war started with Crimea was occupied. And over 250,000 Crimean Tatars are now repressed by Russia. And we know that these people were deprived of their other chance to their identity, their motherland, their right to live their life and to speak their language. And the war at Donbass started, and a big part of a territory was occupied, and over 10,000 were killed. Over 2 million people are eternally displaced people, those who lost their houses, lost their land, lost their relatives. And all of this also the continuation of the self-determination that started at Maidan. It's impossible to get over that emotion because so many people paid with their lives and they continue paying with their lives.
Can you briefly explain how you got there and what your role was at Maidan?
I was an activist when Maidan started. We were at NGO that was doing many different activities connected. For example, with monitoring the corruption in the government, we demanded our MPs to show the declaration of the assistance declarations, to show the results of their work. And my organization was also one of the founders of the movement Stop Censorship. We were fighting against the pressure and repressions of journalists. And we also stood for European reforms. My civil organization was in a coalition when we demanded the new vision for the country from the government. And of course, when the government of Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement, we were one of the first activists who came here under the monument of Maidan to protest against the decision because we thought that this decision took our future away.
During Maidan, Central Europe was watching breathless and with fingers crossed. There were some people from Central Europe speaking at Maidan, but that was 4 years ago, and there were some expectations that you had, and also those we had from Ukraine. After 4 years, can you say something has been achieved?
Of course, no doubt. I guess that Ukraine has really made a civilizational shift. And probably for the first time in our country, we have a president who is supporting European integration. We have pro-European opposition, a civil society and journalists. 70% of Ukrainians support the pro-European choice. 70% of Ukrainians support the NATO choice. And I believe that was the key that happened to us. It was a positive mutation that happened in the DNA of our people, of our nation. And besides that, I think that in the last 3 years, we voted and adopted more progressive European decisions that had happened in the previous 23 years. I'm talking now about many things. For example, the creation of an anti-corruption bureau. For the first time, we see that we have the anti-corruption bodies that investigate corruption against ministers, politicians, MPs, prosecutors, judges. It had never happened before. We see how Ukraine created open registries with access to public information. Anybody can check any organization for ownership of assets. We created, for example, the public broadcaster. Since 2014, we haven't had a state broadcaster in Ukraine, where the state has been able to disseminate censorship in the media and manipulate the media. We adopted electronic declarations, and each deputy, each official shows the property they own. We adopted new legislation in education to make it more inclusive, in healthcare, which is one of the most corrupted areas. It is all very complicated. It moves forward very gradually. But I believe those changes becomes the beginning of changes that cannot be reversed. But all of this is still not enough. Those changes, they are probably the fundamental ones, like the change of the foundations, but we also have to build the walls, the windows, we need to install the roof. So, on the one hand, I see our achievement is that this movement cannot be reversed. These changes of post-Soviet country that used to be satellite of Russia and now has turned into an independent European country. But we have a long way ahead of us, so that people inside this country could feel that their life has become easier, that they live according to European standards.
In Slovakia, we had a crucial election in 1998. Until then, we had Mečia as prime minister, and rumors said that Slovakia would turn into something like Belarus, not a Western country. Yet Slovaks voted differently in the election, and then temptation came. The good ones, those on the right side, got into power. They got some opportunities. And this was also followed by disappointment. And I'm wondering if there is a similar risk in Ukraine nowadays. Those people from Poroshenko to you who made the change, aren't they losing trust due to the occurrence of corruption and the lack of reforms? Isn't there a risk that people will turn to the past?
I feel that there is a lot of disappointment in Ukrainian society, and I believe it's a fair disappointment. First, because we had the big expectations. As I said, people are paying with their lives for these changes. But the second thing is that a lot has been done. But even more could have been done. Of course, there is no monopoly of oligarchs to make decisions, but corruption still remains a huge problem in this country. We see schemes at the level of big political teams, political actors. We see the corruption that is still a part of politics, of the electoral system. And of course, people don't want to put up with this because it's what they protested against. And I think that it makes us further away from the chance to create this transformation as soon as possible. Because today we see a lot of support from European and international partners against the Russian aggression, against the war that we are going through. But I also feel that when Ukraine is not moving fast enough, or when it turns a blind eye to the internal problems, Europeans understand it, and they don't want to share the responsibility with not being willing to adopt difficult changes. As an example, last week, our parliament, unfortunately, kept in force the electronic declarations for civil activists. I think this is a revenge against many anti-corruption investigators who are trying to investigate corruption, and the government is trying to make those civil activists vulnerable. I was one of those MPs who was against this legal initiative. We created a coalition. We had a campaign organized. But we see that our efforts were not enough. Because, in my opinion, probably about 20% of new people came into the government, those who had new values, and we still are not the decision makers. We are more the troublemakers. We are those who create troubles for people who are still supporting corruption. So in order to complete this change, we need more younger generation in politics.
Po tom Majdane zo strany Ruska sa stali
After Maidan,
dve veci.
Russia did some crucial things. They stole Crimea from you. They started a war in Donbass.
Propagandu, že vlastne na Ukrajine prišlo
And they are spreading propaganda
prevratu.
all over the world, saying that Ukraine, in fact, underwent a fascist coup.
Vy ste boli na tom Majdane, videli ste tých zomierajúcich ľudí.
You were at Maidan and you saw those dying people.
Ako sa cítite?
How do you feel when the Russians do this?
Why the Russians are doing this? Can you repeat it, please?
How do you feel about that?
Я відчуваю, що західний світ дозволяє Росії заходити.
I feel that the Western world lets Russia go as far as we let them go. I think that today, Russia is using all the democratic possibilities that exist in the West in order to undermine those values and public trust from inside. You say that Russia discredits the Ukrainian government. Yes, but I see it as one of those elements of discrediting Western values and Western democracy in general. I see that Ukraine is only a small part of this global plan because we see how Russia, in parallel with this, participates in the election in the US, in Germany, in France, in Catalonia, in referendum in the Netherlands where the Netherlands were voting concerning the Ukraine-EU association agreement. We see how Russia is using Russia Today, which has over 1 billion viewers all over the world, to disseminate fake information, not just about Ukraine, but also about Western countries themselves. Do you remember that rape girl, Lisa, that caused the protests in Berlin against Merkel's government because the police allegedly did not investigate this case? But as it turned out, that story just did not exist, of course. But the Russian media were promoting it so actively in order to undermine the people's trust in their governments from within. And I see that it's now one big strategy, changing and ruining the security system in the world, changing the balance of power in the world. And I think Putin declared it in 2007 during the Munich Security Conference. And he continues implementing this plan in a systematic and gradual way. Many people in the West are skeptical about it, and they don't believe that Russia can get so far. But we see that they don't stop. The last case is that poisoning of a British citizen, Skripal, an intelligence officer. And we see, finally, that the Europeans can feel that this hybrid war does not only happen here in the East, that Russia not only says that Ukrainians are liars, they are leading an active war against the Western governments. So, my conclusion is that Ukraine won't be able to overcome this Russian hybrid aggression, and information aggression alone, because here we are allies with the Western world, but it's a question to the Western leaders, can they see the strategy of fighting this not just within the framework of the intellectual period, when the Russian money in their economies interferes with making very difficult decisions.
My Slováci, my Česi, my Maďari, my
We,
Poliaci,
the Slovaks,
my
Czechs,
Európska únia,
Hungarians and Poles, we as the European Union are your neighbours.
si majú pomáhať.
And neighbours should help each other.
Cítite pomoc Európy, alebo čo by
Can
vám
you
pomohlo?
feel any help from the EU? What would be helpful for you?
As of today, the most effective tool for helping us is the sanctions against Russia that deter further aggression by Russia. And we see that Putin won the elections again with unprecedented support, and he has now a new mandate to continue implementing those destabilizing scenarios in Ukraine as well. The second thing is the unity of understanding, unity in approaches and the vision for how to protect themselves, not to protect Ukraine, but to protect Western democracy, Western values, because we consider ourselves to be part of this world. Informally, so far, we are not members of the EU or NATO, but we understand that we are not members of EU or NATO until this is what Russia wants, because this aggression has really interfered with logical completion of these logical integration processes that started at Maidan. The third thing is the perspective. I think that if today we continue to be afraid of Russia, then we or Europe can also undermine their own interests. Once you, our neighbors, Slovaks, Poles, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, were integrated because there was a strategic vision and understanding that those countries should be a part, first, of NATO to have security umbrella, and then members of the EU, because it meant creating a safe space around Europe, a space of economic success and social integration. So I think for us, it's really important that Europe, our neighbors, help us create this vision that Ukraine is a part of this plan for Europe, for the US, for G7, for G20 in this world. And the last thing is that now, probably even more important than European integration, is solidarity on security. We understand that nowadays in the global world, you cannot protect yourself until you are part of big security bloc. Russia did not go further than Ukraine because there is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty that says one for all and all for one. In case somebody attacks one member of NATO, all the others should defend it. And this deterred Russia from further aggression. And I like to remind all of our partners that in 1994, Ukraine voluntarily gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security guarantee in the framework of the Budapest Memorandum, when the President of the US and the UK Prime Minister provided those guarantees to Ukraine. However, unfortunately, after Russian aggression, we did not see decisive steps to implement those guarantees. Probably because they were afraid of further escalation from Russia. So, as of today, the security perspective for Ukraine is decisive from the point of view of solving all the problems that exist in Ukraine.
Keď bola na Ukrajine oranžová revolúcia,
During the Orange Revolution,
Ukrajina mala veľkú šancu.
Ukraine had a great opportunity.
Tá šanca sa veľmi
It did not work out so well.
Pred 4 rokmi ste si
4
vybojovali.
years ago, you
ďalšiu
fought to
šancu.
gain another opportunity,
Stalo to aj ľudské životy. A chcem sa úplne
and it even
krátko
took human lives.
Podarí sa
Very
to?
short question. Will it be successful this time?
I think that we don't have any other way. We only need to think this way because this is our only chance to succeed as a country, so that all those sacrifices that we had, that still continue to happen, will not be in vain. I want to remind you that Ukraine was probably the only country where people with European flags were and are giving up their lives for security, for freedom, and European values. The Orange Revolution is a good example. I'd like to remind you that in 2008, there was the Bucharest Summit, a NATO summit, when the world was considering whether to provide the membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. Two countries were against it. They were afraid of the escalation with Russia. There were France and Germany. They were afraid that if they provided the security umbrella for Ukraine and Georgia, this would destabilize Russia further in its aggression. But instead of some escalation, we received two hot wars, real wars. First, in Georgia in 2008, and then in Ukraine. So I think these historical lessons should be learned not just here in Ukraine, but also by European partners. So we will certainly do our eternal homework. I think that today the Ukrainian government has done a lot, but it's not good enough. And we see that Ukrainian society does not forgive the government for not doing enough. Because we see that the ratings of all the politicians are very low now. And it is proof that Ukrainians will not put up with corruption, with dishonesty in the state. They demand new relations between the government and society. But I also think that not enough has been done from the side of European partners in order to stop the war, in order to forecast the war and not let war happen. And this is the lesson for our Western partners. And I think that we have one common challenge and one common goal. Because if we become successful, we will become a model for transformation for many other countries in the region. For all the post-Soviet area, for Belarus, for Armenia, for Kazakhstan, for Azerbaijan, and for Russia as well in the end. Democratizing Russia, making the post-Soviet area more democratic, which is over 200 million people, will only work after this transformation happens in Ukraine. So I would like our Western partners, the NATO and the EU, to be able to see this new model of transformation and a new know-how that will become an export product for the whole post-Soviet area.
Thank you very much.
Дуже дякую. Дякую.
Na úvod sa teda opýtam, počuli ste, čo
But first,
hovorila?
let me ask you, did you hear what this lady said? Marek? Yes, sir. I did.
Čo k tomu my zo
What can we,
Strednej Európy
as Central Europeans, add?
Tak Ukrajina samozřejmě je pro nás velice důležitý partner.
For us, Ukraine naturally is an important partner. And things that were happening and are happening in Ukraine are, to a certain extent, similar to events in our country. I need to say that especially the fact we are sitting at the Maidan locale means a lot to me. The Maidan events and then the invasion of the Russian army to the eastern part of Ukraine made me join the political life. Because the position of the Czech president and the Czech government towards Russia, and especially towards Russia's approach to Ukraine, showed me that even in Central Europe, some forces of the past are emerging. I call them evil ghosts of the past, and I don't want this to repeat for my country, our future and future generations. So I see a strong connection here And for us in Central Europe, it will take a lot of hard work to eliminate and overcome these ghosts of the past with their totalitarian regimes and corruption.
Géza, čo sa deje na Ukrajine, ako sa to
Géza,
týka
how
včerajšieho a
are the
dnešného
events
Maďarska?
in Ukraine related to yesterday's and today's Hungary? Is there a connection?
Hát Magyarországon mindenképpen nagyon fontos, hogy figyeljünk Ukrajnára. Ukrajna
In
a
Hungary,
legnagyobb szomszédunk.
it is important to pay attention to Ukraine.
Részt vettek a rendszerváltozásban.
Ukraine is our biggest neighbor.
Akik 56-ban
In Hungary, those who took part in the transition, in the change of the regime, or even in 56, who were so much aware and conscious. They felt that Maidan is similar to the events when people rise against dictatorship and they can reach something.
orosz és nem csak orosz
However, propaganda,
elég sokan azt hiszik Magyarországon, hogy
Russian propaganda and other propaganda make people believe in Hungary that Maidan was made by Americans. There are different stories telling us how much it cost Americans, how much they paid for this, and that this was not a real revolution. Of course, the official perspective in Hungary was that Hungary is happy with it. And when Ukraine had really big troubles, when the Russian aggression happened, then Hungary disapproved this. Many people say that we were not obstinate enough, that we were not determined enough in our disapproval. But Hungary approved all the decisions of the EU, and I hope that it will always be like this, that Hungarian society will always think like this. Taking 1956 into consideration, we are surprised to see the kind of Hungarian-Russian friendship that we have now. It's not a problem. We don't have to be angry with the Russians. We don't have to see enemies in them. But we may and should be angry with Russian leadership. I would be happier, much happier, if Hungarian leadership, Hungarian government were much more decisive and take the side of Ukraine more decisively.
Hovoríme o tom, čo sa deje na Ukrajine a
We are talking about events in Ukraine, and right next to it
o ktorom sa už
there is Belarus, and Belarus is not being talked about very much. But this country is also a part of Europe, and we can see journalists being arrested there, as well as politicians. A colleague of yours was supposed to be here. Who is he, and why isn't he here?
Belarus
is a specific country. This is a country in which someone has always been imprisoned on political grounds. In Belarus, there are more than 10 political prisoners nowadays. Yesterday, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Belarusian Democratic Republic. Similar holidays are celebrated at the state level in Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia. In Belarus, this is the holiday for people who stand for the European values, who want freedom. Vladimir Nikolai, who was supposed to be at this place today, was one of the active participants of the event. Despite us having got permission from the official authorities for the first time in many years, some oppositional leaders were preventively detained. Vladimir Nikolai, a poet and a famous person in Belarus, was imprisoned until yesterday late evening, as well as 100 other persons who were also detained yesterday in Minsk. While we're talking here, in the so-called Belarusian courts, the political processes are going on right now. This demonstrates the ambiguity of the situation in Belarus. Geographically, we are in the center of Europe, while politically, we are in the past, the Soviet past. Alexander Lukashenko is a very typical Soviet governor, for whom one of the main examples is Joseph Stalin. He is a person stuck in the past. However, new situations and threats emerge, including those connected with the events in Ukraine, and Lukashenko is forced to change something. Yesterday, we were allowed by the authorities to come to the center of Minsk for the first time in many years, and more than 50,000 Belarusians, the European Belarusian, came to the center of the capital, came with ideas, with a message that Belarus is European and that Belarus should move to European values and Europe. But we paid the price for that. And this price is the freedom of Nicolau and others. I should say that I myself was imprisoned after the presidential campaign of 2010 and spent 108 days in the KGB prison, the most horrible prison in present-day Europe. Since then, few things changed. There were death squads which used to kidnap and kill oppositional politicians. We still have such prisons, and the security services still have the name KGB. The reason for that is not a lack of fantasy, but because this is an important element of the governments of Lukashenko. Fear is a strategic ally of Lukashenko.
Ešte jedna otázka k Ukrajine. Keď sa bieloruský disident
One more
pozerá
question
na to, čo sa deje na Ukrajine.
about Ukraine. As a Belarusian dissident, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, is it important for you, Belarusians, whether Ukraine succeeds?
Був час, коли події в Україні
We had a period when the events in Ukraine actually hampered those who supported changes in Belarus. Ms. Svitlana Zalishchuk, MP of Verkhovna Rada, mentioned Russia Today. In Belarus, we have 10 such Russia Todays. I mean Russian federal TV channels that broadcast in Belarus. And we are well aware how the Russian propaganda manipulates the Ukrainian factor, the events in Ukraine. For a long time, Ukraine was used for escalating fear, and the Belarusians were actually afraid. But time passes, and the attitude of Belarusians to the situation in Ukraine gradually changes. It is important for us to demonstrate that in Ukraine, despite many problems, such as ones with corruption, there are changes. There is the freedom that we lack in Belarus, and many Belarusians come today to Kiev just to breathe the air of freedom. Many Belarusians see that despite the corruption, there are opportunities for the development of small and medium-sized businesses here. Recently, Poroshenko and Lukashenko have agreed for at least one Ukrainian TV channel to broadcast in Belarus. It is very important to have an alternative to Russian propaganda in Belarus as a source of information. Today, the so-called Russian world is the threat number one for Belarus, and even Lukashenko realizes that. He allows us to come to the center of Minsk because he understands that, similar to Ukraine, his generals are not the guarantors of the sovereignty of a democratic country. That's why he is forced to broaden the space for a European alternative. Despite these difficulties, there are people in Belarus who tell the truth about Ukraine. We, during all our electoral campaigns, use the example of Ukraine as an example of freedom. I'm sure that the solution of the Belarusian problem is being developed now in Ukraine. The future of Belarus depends on whether Ukraine goes nowadays. A successful Ukraine would become a very important signal for Belarusians.
My v Strednej Európe
We, Central Europeans, watch the Ukrainians fight for dignity and freedom. We watch the Belarusians being arrested for fighting for freedom. What are we fighting for, the Czechs and Hungarians? What serious things are happening in our countries? Are they still related to freedom? Marek.
Tak určitě ta situace bude jiná, než je třeba v Bělorusku. Myslím si, že jsme od toho roku 89...
Situation certainly different from that in Belarus. For instance, I think that we have walked a long way since 1989, when our revolutions and velvet revolutions. And as I mentioned, the ghosts of the past seem to be creeping in again these days. So what are we fighting for? We need to struggle to maintain our democracy, and we need to keep cultivating it, because there are some politicians who try to undermine it. In the case of the Czech Republic, it is especially our president, Miloš Zeman, who expresses clearly pro-Russian attitudes. It is necessary to add that he is surrounded with people who have direct connections to the Russian President Putin, and they are primarily interested in business. In the Czech Republic, we are currently facing attempts to undermine democratic institutions. This is something we did not really feel until recently, and now we can see such attacks more and more frequently. We're talking about the freedom of media here. There are Czech populist politicians who are trying to restrict Czech television, our free public service broadcaster. They would like to put it under state ownership to get it under their control. Generally speaking, in the Czech Republic and other countries, there are attempts to privatize political power, and that is something we really need to stand up against. We need to defend and cultivate democracy. What is currently the main conflict, the main problem in Hungary?
Magyarországon a rendszerváltozást az értelmiség, valóban a szabadság, az emberi jogok megérvényesülése.
The change of the regime was thought to be the change of values and the intelligentsia, intellectuals. We were looking forward to gaining wealth from the change of the regime, and we couldn't reach this wealth in the degree expected. But it was really important that we believed in human rights and freedom and liberty. And it was, and it still is very important in Hungary that minority rights are a part of human rights. We are aware of how many people consider themselves Hungarian living in the neighbouring countries. In the past few years, mainly during the past two terms of the actual government, that of Mr. Viktor Orbán, it's not only foreigners, but also a big part of Hungarian society who can feel that the question of human rights went somewhat into the background, and the basic values of human rights are questioned. We cannot say Hungary would be a dictatorship, but we can say we have got an authoritarian system. We can have strong arguments for this, and it is sad to see that the values, the ideologies, the concept of the change of the regime are now endangered. And our society, a big part of our society, is not worried about this. So the elections that we are going to have on April the 8th will answer the question of whether Hungary is continuing to go down to being an authoritarian system, or it is trying to get back to democracy with all its difficulties. There are many and big differences between the opposition parties, but there is another very big problem. Individuals, not only in Hungary, certain individuals also abroad, believe that there is a decay of European culture, European civilization, and that this process cannot be stopped. But now if Mr. Orbán wins again, and if there are similar governments in the neighboring countries, like the Austrian Liberty Party, then it could be stopped. People refer to a universal theory, but I don't think it is supported by anything. I believe that liberal democracy is not coming to an end. I believe this means the future for Central Europe, the future that we would like to pass on to our children. This is a very interesting confrontation. We have had here a Ukrainian member of parliament and a Belarusian who would be very happy to be a part of the West, part of the European Union and NATO. We are a part of it, and we cast certain doubts. In the Czech Republic, it is questioned by President Zeman. In Hungary, by the Prime Minister Orban and others. What has happened to us? Why aren't we more grateful for what we have? Marek.
Já si myslím, že to není úplně tak jednoznačné, že v těch společnostech, aspoň teda pokud
I think it is not as simple and clear as that. I can speak for the Czech Republic, the civil society and democracy still have a good reputation and significance. The fact that we currently have a 51% majority of those who are calling for a firm-hand government could be the result of a certain disappointment over the development after 1989. People probably expected that democracy would mean a better life and simple solutions for everything. But democracy and living in freedom also require responsibility and everyday participation in politics. And that is something that needs to be a part of everyone's mentality, the mentality of a self-confident citizen. And this is something that does not happen immediately, not after one revolution. That must become a tradition, and I think we need to discover it inside ourselves and refine it. The desire for freedom, the desire for truth is always present. It is constantly there. Perhaps in the course of events there might be ups and downs for democracy. I'm an optimist because I can see a new generation of leaders emerging in the Czech Republic, those who grew up after 1989, and they are trying to enter the political world. They're trying to speak up now and show that the future can be found by turning back to the past. In the retropia, where many people are looking for certainty and security. Some people are looking for the security of what they know, and they are afraid of what might be. We must be honest here. The globalization processes and events taking place all around the world, the role of superpowers, make people feel worried or scared. And people protect themselves by closing up. We must not allow this to happen. We need to keep showing that the future can be granted by democracy, liberal democracy, as it is the only system that can guarantee prosperity to the majority of ordinary people.
Keď sa písal rok 1989,
mentioning 1989, I remember Hungarian leaders speaking up in squares in Slovakia. I even remember Viktor Orban giving a speech in Bratislava, and after their contributions, we would shout "Kosnoman," which means thank you in Hungarian. Despite all Slovak-Hungarian problems, you were inspiring for us. People from Fidesz, the Hungarian Civic Alliance, with Hungarian dissidents, used to be our inspiration. Nowadays, Hungary is seen as something dangerous, something that we don't want for ourselves. What has happened?
Hát erről egy-két könyvet lehetne írni.
We could write a book or two about this. Indeed, in 1989 to 90, we Hungarians were very proud, together with the Polish, that we were the ones who started to find new ways. And we really believed that as new Central Europe will put an end to all the conflicts. We believed in unification. This also meant that the historic Slovak-Hungarian conflicts would be resolved, or at least they would get on the right way so that Hungarian minorities could have their privileges or rights granted. However, I can say the governments we have had so far since then made many mistakes. There's been so, especially since 2010. Then there has been a change, which has attracted attention worldwide, but not in a good sense as back in 89. This kind of change in rhetoric and propaganda is incomprehensible for the rest of the world, and it can be seen, and I'm sorry to say this, that a part of Hungarian society is acceptable. They can be influenced by this nationalistic rhetoric and propaganda. Many people can be influenced by saying that there were many insults against Hungarians in the past, and that Hungarian independence was only really restored in 1990. The Prime Minister often speaks about the Turks, the Austrians, and the Russians, and now oppressors or occupiers from Brussels, so Hungarian society is very much divided. It's divided much more than our neighbouring countries, and that's why this division is much more serious, because it's not political, but it's based on philosophies, and I think that there has to be a decision. The upcoming elections or the next few years will decide about this because, as I said, many people tend to believe false rhetoric, especially in the countryside, where access to information is rather limited, not in Budapest. But the European Union and NATO are still popular in Hungary. In Hungarian society, a decisive majority said yes in elections to joining these organizations, and we can still see that these two organizations are important. So I believe that if Hungarian society is faced with the fact that we can choose between the Euro-Atlantic world or Putin's world and Asia, then we would choose the former. But there should be free access to information and an open dispute in Hungary about this so that Hungarian society can make this decision. There are some similar disputes about this in our neighbouring countries, so I hope that after this transitional period we can return to the hopes, expectations and ideologies of 1989 to 90 in the next couple of years. When a person from Belarus, a sorely tried country, is listening to the fact that Central Europe is facing tendencies to return to some authoritarian principles, can you understand it?
Погляд на Європу з Мінську.
The opinion on Europe from Minsk, we see that the so-called pragmatic faction has recently strengthened their positions. Europe starts to look at Belarus quite pragmatically, and there are some risks and insecurity for the Europeans themselves in such a policy. First of all, European Belarusians do not understand the new strategy of Brussels towards the Lukashenko regime. 4 years ago, Lukashenko was seen as the last dictator in Europe by the Europeans. 2 years ago, he became a pre-last dictator just after Putin. Today, European Belarusians see that some politicians, if they do not hug Lukashenko, they shake his hands. But in the country, nothing has changed. We do not have any free elections. Another local electoral campaign has just closed. Among the 60,000 members of the electoral commissions, only 30 represented the oppositional parties. If a similar situation were in Hungary, Slovakia, or the Czech Republic, revolution would occur there. We do not have independent courts. We have a very specific economy. Despite this, the Europeans start to think from a geopolitical perspective, but here are also weaknesses. If there is no Belarus, then there will be no free Ukraine. It is a serious threat, serious challenge. The Polish will not feel safe, the Lithuanians and Latvians will not feel comfortable. That's why the European Belarusians, there are many of them, we have discussed the precise number, but there are up to 40% of the population of Belarus are guarantees for the future and perspective for the Europeans. The main European investment should be not into Lukashenko regime, but to the civil society, to independent media, to European Belarusians. This is the main investment that we expect from our European partners. The regime of Lukashenko is very specific. For a long time, it was a laboratory for Putin where he tested the governance models, and today, even in Europe, there are messages for a strong hand. That is not bad. And today, it is very comfortable for Lukashenko when he does not hear any more speeches about values from European politicians, from Brussels, but more pragmatic ideas. We do not understand when the European Union gives a 7 million grant to local governments, as we do not have local governments. The local members of governments are not elected. They are appointed by central authorities, or the grant for the development of the judicial system. All the judges are appointed personally by Lukashenko. Strategically, we are interested in strengthening the values faction not only in the Central Europe, but in all other European countries. Any support to an authoritarian regime leads to the conservation of the regime. If you close your eyes today, you would lose the most valuable thing. Supporters of the European values in Belarus, people who are disappointed with Lukashenko, and who do not see any European perspective, look to Putin's direction. There is the threat to Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. We should always keep that in mind. For sure, we lack solidarity, we lack cooperation to counteract the so-called Russian world. What Russia is doing nowadays is it invests in NGOs, in the Orthodox Church, in media. And the EU decreases its support to the civil society, and not only European Belarusians lose, but also Brussels and our neighbours lose from that. One more question. When Slovakia was making a decision whether we would become a part of the West or turn into another Belarus, however rough it may sound, it was very helpful that the EU and NATO gave us clearly defined conditions. We knew that if we were able to fulfill them, we would be a Western country, and that was motivating for people. Is there anything like this for Belarus? Are there prospects for Belarus to become a part of the West? Anything clear, helpful from the side of the EU? Are you lacking this?
Ми реалісти.
We are realists, and we do understand that tomorrow Belarus will not become member of the EU. However, the message to the people should exist. We should not say definitely that the door is closed, that your choice is between Putin and Putin. This is not a choice for Belarus. We are a country with a European history, and the first written constitution was adopted in Belarus. The Great Duchy of Lithuania is a state where the Belarusian language used to be official. For the youth, it is important to open the doors. It could be done through the educational programs for the youth. The EU could decrease the cost for visas for Belarusians, for the visa to cost €35, not 60, because the average salary in Belarus is $200, while the prices in Belarus are 30% higher than in Poland. We do not have any economic wonder. Our economy has been basically supported by Moscow, and this support has decreased nowadays. As Lukashenko could not buy support from the Belarusians, many people started to look for where to go further. The message from Brussels should clearly state that you support the European values in Belarus, and that the perspective of Belarus depends on people, on their choice. The Belarusians do not have a right to choose. We could not elect the parliament, we could not elect the president, we could not even choose where to go, to the east or the west. To have that choice, there should be free elections. That's why our supporters are the media in Slovakia, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary. They are our allies. Our allies are human rights defenders, as they have their values and they support people who get arrested and fined. Our allies are political organizations who do not fall into populism. And we offer our hands to all allies and want them to see European Belarusian waiting to hear about the European choice for the Belarusians. And now, back to Central Europe. Historically, Central Europe has been an important location of interesting ideas, philosophers, and culture. Central Europe of 1989 even became an inspiration for the rest of the world, a role model showing how to get rid of totalitarian regimes and start from scratch. Nowadays, Central Europe, and specifically the Visegrad Group, is seen as a sort of a failure by some in the West, an area where strange things are happening. So, my last question is, what shall we do about it? I think I would compare this to a child being born. When a baby is to be born, there are always big expectations, and there is a lot of hope. And I guess that is what was happening in 1989. People had hopes that something new was born after the fall of totalitarian regimes. Then the baby starts to grow and interact with the world. It starts to learn, and perhaps sometimes it does not learn enough. Sometimes the baby gets ill. So I still see it as a process. As I said, you need democracy to get under your skin. People must understand what freedom is. They must appreciate freedom as an important value, because if it is not a value for them, they may lose it as they are not able to fight for it. Living in freedom is a great responsibility. It is not that simple. Sometimes it is easier when somebody else makes decisions for you. And this is what seems to be happening now. Populists and oligarchs offer seemingly simple solutions and they say, we can solve the world's problems for you. Just hand your power over to us and don't worry about anything, and then everything will be all right. But naturally, this is wrong. It is a mistake which was made many times in history. So what can we do? We need to appreciate freedom, because if we do not cherish it, we may lose it. Nevertheless, I mentioned I am an optimist. I will quote the Czech church reformer Jan Hus, who said that the truth may suffer a lot, but it can never get killed because people long for it. So we will see what the course of events will be, but people will always inspire for freedom. We need to build the civil society and show that democracy is a regime that is truly beneficial for the majority, unlike an oligarchy, which is only beneficial for a small group of people. We need to be aware of this. Unless we realize this, we can hardly do anything about it. I am really an optimist. I can see new leaders emerging in Central Europe. They have traveled the world, seen how democracy works, and worked in democratic countries, and I rely on them. I trust this new generation, and I believe we have not had our freedom taken away from us.
Čo sa dá a čo sa má urobiť,
What can be done,
aby Maďarsko sa vrátilo
what
do
should be
konceptu
done
ľudských
for
práv,
Hungary to get back to the concept of human rights and eliminate authoritarian tendencies?
Nyilvánvaló, hogy minden ország felelős a saját sorsáért, és nagy hiba lenne.
It's obvious that every country is responsible for its own fate. It would be a huge mistake to expect that kind of help from abroad. The decision to overthrow a regime that is considered to be bad. So what our short-term future is going to be like depends on Hungarian society. However, we do need help, especially when freedom of the press is very limited and the media are biased. So voters do not get the information necessary to make a responsible decision. So the question is this: how could we make Hungarians aware of the world tendencies? How can we make them not fall for false stories and false news? And how can we make them realize what their real interests are? Even though there are many people in Hungary who are trying to achieve this, but unfortunately their means are very limited, because they cannot reach society outside Budapest. On the other hand, some people have tremendous and blind faith in Viktor Orbán, as he is indeed a very talented man. He's got charisma, as people say. So whatever he does, these people stand behind him. But this is only a minority. The majority is either neutral or strongly against him. So how can we achieve a majority devoted to democracy and wishing to live in a free Hungary? I think the European Union has a big role in this. I understand the sanctions or the threatening with sanctions, but it's also very easy to turn this against the EU and say how Brussels is against the welfare of Hungarian society. I wouldn't use the word propaganda. I would use the word information. We have to deliver factual information to Hungarians. A few months ago, we got an offer from the United States of a low amount to promote, to help the media in the countryside in Hungary. Many people were satisfied with this. But again, there were remarks that the US was intervening in our domestic matters. The EU may have more opportunities in this regard. I don't have a prepared recipe for how it is possible to better reach Hungarian society and how to represent Brussels through journalists and politicians to help people devoted to democracy succeed in the elections. The question is rather if we have enough time. We are going to have the elections in 2 weeks' time, and we can say that if Mr. Viktor Orbán wins again, even though I clearly doubt that he can have the same two-thirds majority, then Hungary will continue its way towards decay. We cannot simply say that this will change in 4 years' time. But even then, I suspect that there will be some disappointment, especially if we no longer get the subventions from the European Union, or if world tendencies prove that the threats that our Prime Minister and the government party used to threaten us turn out not to be true, or much less significant than they were made out to be, that the Western world is not falling, then our society can awaken and get back to our aims from 1989.
Posledné slovo bude mať Bielorusko.
The last question in this section is for Belarus. A very short question with a very short answer. Do you think there is hope for Belarus to become a free country? I position myself as a leader of Belarusian political optimists, and I believe in my country. I believe in its perspective. I believe that this is a price for freedom. Those who inspire us in the Czech Republic, and I am sorry, this is not your incumbent president, but Václav Havel, whom I had the honor to meet. From Slovakia, it was more pleasant for me to meet Dzurinda, whose experience could be important for our future economic reforms. As a leader of political optimists, I would say that Belarus is our home within the European quarter. And I believe if there is solidarity, we will achieve that much sooner.
Ďakujem pekne.
Thank you very much.
Máme tu ministra zahraničných vecí Ukrajiny, máme tu veľvyslanca Európskej únie na Ukrajine a máme tu poľského.
We have invited Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, the EU ambassador to Ukraine, and a Polish writer. And in this segment, we are going to discuss what has been achieved in those 4 years since Maidan and what Ukraine is to do now and how we could help Ukraine. But first, I will ask the Minister, are you happy with the current situation in Ukraine 4 years after Maidan? First, it's superb that such a discussion has emerged, because one can just discuss what has happened and what is next without any messages, but with sense. Second, I consider that Ukraine for Central Europe is existentially possible. Without Ukraine, Central Europe as such does not exist. And if one looks at the history of over a millennium, Ukraine has always been present in it. We have lost that Central Europe. nowadays does not exist at all as a community which we had yet 100 years ago. We lost it because of many events, because of world wars, because of famine, because of Holocaust. We have now lost it all, but now Central Europe must return. We understand fairly well in Central Europe that there were people oriented towards different centres. Today, we have to find this community. For Ukraine, which was actually post-Soviet in spite of 20 years of its independence, Maidan became the borderline with a post-Soviet Ukraine over these 4 years. This is a way how Ukraine was in general developing, but still remained post-Soviet. The mentality remained post-Soviet. All systems from education to healthcare were functioning in a post-Soviet style. And big business clusters and oligarchs, they simply controlled the situation in a different way. But very little has changed for the people. And now we have started on a road towards Europe and a democratic Europe. But we still have a lot to do in order for the generation to reboot. That is, young people react very quickly, but society as such must reboot. Yet, while answering your question, I think that not everybody in Central Europe understands well that Ukraine is existentially important for Central Europe. Not only in view of security, that there is a certain border in Ukraine, yet only now do people realize that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine who voluntarily went to fight for freedom. For a certain understanding of Ukraine as they imagined it in their minds, as free Ukraine, as a Ukraine that is moving forward. But we need to build this community. There is no such community in Central Europe. Because of that, there are many different ideas. Someone speaks about 3 Cs. Someone speaks about something else. But there is no such community. Just look at what we know about Poland, about Polish culture, about Polish writers, about Polish jazz, about Polish cuisine or other things. But what do we know about Belarus? Just a moment ago, here was a representative of Belarus. Here in Ukraine, we know much more about others. What do we know about Slovakia? If we are to ask, let's go to Maidan and ask. That is, we know more about Brussels or Berlin than our neighbours in Bratislava. Should it be so? I believe that no. That is, we have learned some business contacts. Now we have to build this community again. And I think that this can be done only after Maidan, since, by definition, Ukraine belonged to another world. She belonged to another world that Russia tried to control as its zone or influence. Now it's not like that, but nevertheless we are well aware what was a borderline in Europe in the medieval times. It was the Magdeburg Law. By the way, do you know that there is a monument to Magdeburg Law in Kiev? And there is no such monument in Magdeburg. That is why we must now fully return and build Central Europe here.
A teraz úplne jednou vetou, že keby ste mali oznámkovať.
And now briefly, in one sentence.
Keď ste mali oznámkovať to, čo sa za 4 roky podarilo.
How would you evaluate
Jednotka je najlepšia, 5 je
the results achieved in Ukraine in those last 4 years? On a scale from 1 for the best to 5 for the worst, like a school mark.
One sentence.
I will not be able to give a mark. I honestly say I'm neither a teacher nor a professor. But I'll say that we have definitely left that post-Soviet Ukraine. For this, we have earned a good mark. Because we were not able to get there where we wanted to be, we have a bad mark. So I would give 2 marks. 1 good and 1 bad.
Pán ambasador, hovorí pravdu?
Mr. Ambassador, is he right?
There is no doubt at all that Ukraine has been carrying out more reforms over the last 4 years than between 1992 and 2014. And this in the most difficult circumstances. while they were waging a war to preserve their mere sovereignty, independence and existence. And therefore, full praise for the Ukrainian people for that and their leadership.
Keď sme tu pred pár mesiacmi boli, tak sme sa pýtali ľudí, ako sú spokojní. A
a few months ago,
hovorili, že
we came here and asked people how satisfied they were. Some of them said that a lot had been achieved, but many things needed to carry on. For example, there is a new mayor and a new government, but certain positions were only given to friends, and the corruption is still present, and people find it frustrating.
Petro Poroshenko mal 50%, viac ako 50%, dnes má 10%.
Petro Poroshenko had more than 50%, now he has about 10%. Is there a risk the process will reverse?
Well, I believe that, again, a lot has been done in meaningful areas under the most difficult circumstances, but at the same time, it is clear that we have to do far more, especially when it comes to the rule of law. Because the weaknesses, the very deep weaknesses which exist in Ukraine in this sector have a negative repercussion on the reform process in many other sectors. And therefore, all reformers in Ukraine, in the government, in the Verovna Rada, in the civil society, should do far more to push the fight against corruption and to push everything which is related to the rule of law. And this is what we in the European Union try to do, to back the reformers to win this battle because it is a crucial one. It is true as well that more should be done in the field of social cohesion. Because despite the many reforms which have been carried out, you continue to have in this country a level of social inequalities which is just indecent. Look outside, the number of Porsche, Ferrari and so on, and when the average citizen is struggling to survive with less than 200 euro per month. And if nothing is done in this area, to fight social inequalities, it may be that the populists will manage to rally a large majority of the Ukrainian people who want to move closer to the EU, but which will be absolutely discouraged by the absence of effort to reduce social inequalities. So in this area of social cohesion, we have as well to make everything possible to ensure that the Ukrainian leadership is convinced on the need to do something.
You were watching Ukraine from Poland, but you're also traveling around Ukraine. In the last 4 years, has Ukraine changed?
Tak, zdecydowanie. Chciałem tutaj zgodzić się z panem ambasadorem, mówiąc
I agree with Mr. Ambassador, especially in social issues, because that is what is really important now in Ukraine.
Myślę, że to jest kwestia kluczowa, dlatego że
And now it is a critical question. We have seen that in Central European countries, when that narrative related to European integration was over, for the Polish,
pojawiła się pustka, pojawiła się
for
pustka
the
narracyjna.
Czech Republic,
Tę pustkę wypełniają
for
populiści.
Hungarians,
Nie ma
then there
racjonalizmu,
was some emptiness.
radykalne rozwiązania.
This emptiness was filled by populists, and on the other side, there is no appropriate narrative yet in Poland and in Hungary.
Populiści są silni, że są wyjątkowo silni, tylko dlatego, że nie mają odpowiedniej kontrnarracji.
Populists are strong in Hungary and Poland, not because they are that good, because there is no alternative. And it is also due to social inequalities. This is really important in Ukraine and also in Poland. We can defend Ukraine from frustration stemming from the lack of quick effects of European integration. We can defend Ukraine from such quick attacks. Turning back now to what Mr. Ambassador said, I was in the Donbass region, Avdiivka, Donetsk. I was traveling there not long ago, and I was told that people were happy when they could seize their human rights after some turbulence, but the level of corruption is still very high. This causes constant frustration, especially in the east, when there are many Ukrainians for whom these values are not that clear. In the west of Central Europe, I agree that it is much more important and present, but this kind of narrative is missing from the East. This has an influence also on their political choices. I have the impression that it is often frustration that is represented in politics, which is why we can see the influence of the integration of the East and West in Ukraine.
Pán minister,
Minister,
rozumiete ľuďom, ktorí
do you
vás volili?
understand the people who elected you, the people who voted for a civilized Ukraine
západného sveta?
as a part of the Western world, yet at the same time they feel frustrated because of the corruption related to your government? Do you understand them?
Я розумію дуже добре.
I understand very well. And in fact, if you look at the situation and ask here in Maidan, what is the attitude of people to reforms, then they are a bit tired of the reforms as such. From the very notion of them, because not all of the reforms are important for us. They are pushed by politicians and have to be implemented by politicians together with everyone else. People need real changes. There was a very significant emotional impulse during and after Maidan. There were expectations, and after these expectations, many people, an absolute majority, if you wish, hoped that the changes would be very fast. But very rapid changes, but not reforms as such, about which we can talk endlessly, unfortunately did not happen. Its cause is, of course, corruption. It's high level, which is also a fact. The culprit is that it is very difficult to change the entire political class quickly, really. And not only the political class, it's very difficult to build the system itself. It's just my answer to your question about the evaluation, because we have left post-Soviet Ukraine, but we have not reached the Ukraine to which we want to go. And now Ukrainians, and these are millions of Ukrainians who know Poland, who know Central Europe, and who know Europe, they see the difference very clearly. And this difference, it's a sense of the prospect for the future. And this is a sense of that quality of life. And this is exactly what many Ukrainians do not sense. And for that, I consider that we do not deserve a good mark. That is the launch of changes. It's positive, certainly. But getting a good mark for what is happening, unfortunately, we cannot yet talk about it.
Treba súčasne povedať, že Ukrajina je v strašne ťažkej
At the same time, it is necessary to note that Ukraine is in a very difficult position. Your government inherited a dysfunctional economy, dysfunctional prices, and you are in war with Russia. The situation is extremely difficult. And when we had those discussions, there were some expectations that the European Union the West
by vám mohol pomôcť viac.
could help you more.
Občas sa ozýva také, že
Some say that all those grants and so on are good, but it is just little things, and something like the Marshall Plan is needed for Ukraine, as it is a huge country. Do you see the EU's support as sufficient?
Це звичайно недостатньо.
Of course, not enough. But if you look at our economy, let's take 2013. In 2013, the share of trade with Russia was 34%. Now, 7%. Can you imagine what it would have been if now Slovakia went from 34% to 7% in trade with the European Union or with its other partners? Of course, not enough. But if you look at our economy, or because of the occupation of the Crimea and the occupation of the Donbass, due to that we have lost 19%, almost 1/5 of our industrial production, because Donbass was a classic Soviet example of heavy industries. It is mainly coal mines there, it is mainly steel there, but now we must entirely rebuild this model. We cannot live with the previous model. And by the way, what we do with the European Union is that we have a free trade area. Now it's started to move, but it's started to move not as we would like it to move. But the latter is absolutely 100% correct. As for Ukraine, the European Union must understand it as Russia understands it very well. Russia should ruin the Ukrainian project as a democratic and European project. Otherwise, it is impossible to justify the Russian project. And Russians should destroy the Ukraine project, since then there will be no place to return the Crimea to. But Europe must understand that the existence of a European democratic Ukraine is equally important for both the entire European Union and Central Europe. I think that from a political point of view, there is no such understanding at all. We ourselves are, to a large extent, guilty of it because, unfortunately, we have not used the European aid in a way it should have been used. However, I consider that the volume and the very structure of this assistance are not sufficient. Moreover, we are talking about both economic and sectoral aid. We are also talking about security assistance. So, what is the worth, for example, of the position regarding the restrictiveness in security cooperation with Ukraine? I believe this is a fundamental mistake. Therefore, we must have a comprehensive vision of how Europe should work with Ukraine. And this should not be, for example, only such a piece of sectorial cooperation, only such a piece of economic cooperation. This should be the inclusion of Ukraine in Europe. One of the reasons, and I have to say this, is that there are still quite a lot of politicians in Europe who are simply afraid to work with Ukraine as part of Europe and part of the transatlantic community. They're afraid because of various factors. They're afraid because of the attitude of their voters. They're afraid because of Russia. In other words, we can talk about it, but this, of course, is the cause. If the minister is right, and it seems to be true, that Ukraine's future is crucial for the whole European Union, why aren't we, as the EU, capable of a more robust and comprehensive support program for a free Ukraine?
Alors, first of all, there is no doubt that Ukraine is an extremely important country for Western Europe, for the EU. Ukraine is one of the biggest countries on the European continent, one of the most populated countries, with a long industrial tradition, the best agricultural land in Europe, a fantastic touristic potential, highly skilled labor force. So Ukraine is an asset for the European continent. Second point, anything which happens in Ukraine has an impact on the EU. And therefore, we have to do everything possible in the EU to ensure a smooth transition of Ukraine towards an open and democratic society based on a social market economy. And this is why the EU has concluded with Ukraine the most ambitious agreement that we have ever signed with any partner country, our association agreement, under which we are working hard to deepen our political association with this country, and above all, we are working hard to ensure the gradual inclusion of the Ukrainian economy in our EU single market through the implementation of a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. This is a very ambitious agenda. The Ukrainian authorities are determined to implement as quickly as possible this agreement. They have adopted recently an action plan for the government, a joint roadmap for the Verovna Rada and the government, and on our side, we mobilize all our resources to ensure that as quickly as possible, the Ukrainian political life is organized around EU norms and standards, and above all, the Ukrainian economy is part of our EU single market, which is a main trade bloc. This is once again a very ambitious agenda, believe me, and it requires a few years of full political commitment.
To, čo ste ale hovorili, a to, čo hovorí aj pán minister,
what you said and what the minister mentioned was that most tasks are done as Ukraine's homework. Ukraine needs to accomplish them in this very tough situation. But my question is whether we, as the richer and luckier part of Europe, are willing or capable of providing sufficient help.
That's clear that we have an interest and we are capable to extend some kind of assistance to Ukraine. Why? First of all, because we have an experience to share on how to build an open and democratic societies and how to ensure a smooth economic transition. And we have all the tools and instruments today to share with this experience with our Ukrainian friends. We have as well the capability to do so because we have some experience. We in the EU have been doing this kind of work with countries of Central Europe 20 years ago. We have been doing that with countries of the Western Balkans in the last few years. So we have all the necessary experience to know exactly how to share our experience with our Ukrainian partners. The political will is there, the means are there. I do not see which kind of obstacle we should face. We have to be optimistic about our ability to share our experience, to draw Ukraine closer to the EU in the next few years, provided there is on the Ukrainian side the political will to do so. I say provided there is a political will because I have no doubt that the vast majority of the population have the will to move toward the EU. Now it's up to the Ukrainian political class to show that they have understood all this and they are ready, through decisive reforms, to move ahead in this direction.
U nás v Európskej únii, ale
in the EU,
často diskusia
and
o
also
tom,
specifically in Slovakia,
či teda
there
Ukrajina
are
ako celok
frequent discussions whether Ukraine as a whole can be a part of the West. Some say the dividing line between the East and the West goes through Ukraine. Do you think that the whole of Ukraine can be an integral part of the West?
To zależy, w jaki sposób zdefiniuje się naród ukraiński. Czy będzie on narodem etnicznym, czy politycznym. To znaczy,
The first question is how to define the Ukrainian nation, whether it is on an ethical basis or on a political basis.
Cała tak naprawdę problem z identyfikowaniem
The whole identification problem of Ukrainians can be broken down into several ideas. In different places, for example, in Kharkov, the West Ukrainians' concepts are not really well accepted. It is mainly in the eastern part of Ukraine that this kind of integration has to be promoted, and people have to be convinced about this.
No to wtedy dlaczego nie? Rzecz w tym, że
Because then they could say, why not? And again, I get back to the question of European integration, because we have to know what Ukraine means to the European Union.
Ostatnio pewien zachodni dziennikarz, niemiecki dziennikarz zapytał mnie, co Polska...
Recently, a Western journalist asked me what Poland can give to Western Europe. And of course we can say a few things, but truly, I did not really want to repeat the things that we always hear.
Powtarzać tych komunałów i powiedziałem, w gruncie rzeczy to my, przy całym tym mówieniu o integracji, nawet zintegrowawszy się...
When we talk about integration, European integration, we just turn to be a province on the peripheries.
W sensie... I peryferie jako takie cóż mogą zagwarantować Zachodowi?
What can peripheries give to the center? When there was this integrational wave, we had to find ideas. We had to be creative because there were many things that others already have. So now we mainly focus on our ego, on our values. But in Europe, they may be necessary, but I'm not sure. What is really necessary is a realistic assessment of the situation. Question is if we move Poland to the center or if we change our mentality to a central mentality. That is a challenge. Ukraine is facing a similar challenge. If different ideas arise from those of Polish mentality, which focus on nationalism, if these ideas are not nationalistic but good and progressive, then Ukraine will be able to get closer to the West. Then there will be these diversive questions, but there will be other questions.
Pán minister, keď sa hovorí v Európe o tom, či Ukrajina môže byť ako celok súčasťou Západu a či náhodou tá civilizačná línia nejde práve cez Ukrajinu.
Whether Ukraine as a whole can be part of the West and that the civilization dividing line perhaps goes through Ukraine. How do you feel listening to this as Minister of Foreign Affairs?
А насправді ці дискусії завжди були.
But as a matter of fact, there have always been such discussions, and I think that, in fact, we can discuss this line, which passed or did not pass through Ukraine. It was destroyed just at the outset of the war with Russia. I'll say why. For example, we're talking about a purely national identity or a political nation. Look who is now fighting in the East. More than 50% of those who fight there speak Russian. But they are fighting in the same way, together, shoulder to shoulder, with those who speak Ukrainian. In fact, more and more people start speaking Ukrainian. But this is not what is remarkable. Here in Kiev, I have maybe half my friends who speak Ukrainian regularly, and half of those who speak Russian. Nothing changes because of it, but both of them are the same patriots of Ukraine. Because of that, I agree that such a line, a kind of conditional one, might have existed due to historical reasons. But presently, by definition, there is no such line. And sometimes, when they speak in Europe about Ukraine, they say, well, okay, Ukraine is somehow divided there. There are some people who tend more to be Europe. There are Ukrainians who tend less to Europe. But now it is not anymore. That is it, of course. It is a process. But it will go further. And in the presence of the Russian aggression, all Ukrainians understood the value of Ukraine. We are talking about Central Europe, about Europe, who generally understands the value of democracy and the rule of law. It is itself understandable. It exists, and nobody says that it can be taken away. For Ukrainians, this value is now understandable. This value is understandable due to human suffering and the loss of human lives. Therefore, we understood this much better. And there is no line as such. Certainly, if you look at public opinion polls, they're still somewhat different in the East than in the West or in the centre. But the trend is now very clear. There is indeed an alignment trend. I believe that we need to build such a political nation. Ukrainians, we must build a clear vision oriented towards the future. We can look at the past, and we have many examples, but the vision of Ukraine, the vision of the Ukrainian project, is actually in the present and in the future. And for this reason, we need this European assistance so much. That is what Hugues said. Surely this is correct, but let's see how now the European Union or Europe helps us in implementing the association agreement. And if there were no war with Russia, would this implementation be different? I believe that it would not be. It is also the same. Therefore, we must look at it from a technical point of view. We do not have to perceive what is happening right now from a technical viewpoint, from a viewpoint of some lists of what should be done as tasks. It is an existential moment for us now, and Europe must understand it.
Čiže ja sa ešte vrátim k tej otázke. Z toho, čo ste povedali, ako by vyplývalo, že ak aj Ukrajina bola
I will
nejakým
go back to my
spôsobom
question.
rozdelená, tak
From what you've said, one may conclude that even if Ukraine had been divided, Putin's aggression actually led to the formation of a political Ukrainian nation that understands where its position is.
Ну, абсолютно. Це саме так воно і є. Це пішло з Майдана, але особливо з російської
That's exactly how it is.
Те, що
It started from Maidan,
в результаті
but especially after Russian aggression.
агресії
Russian aggression resulted in the unification of Ukraine and the gradual building of such a Ukrainian political nation. It is evidenced by the fact that we are here today, in Maidan, in the restaurant Crime, where we see the Crimean Tatar tradition. Previously, this was not the case, was it? There is now an understanding of the importance of everyone in Ukraine. Previously, it was not like this today. And that is why the building of such a new nation that looks into the future is so important nowadays.
Pán veľvyslanec,
Mr. Ambassador,
poznáte Ukrajinu zvnútra, poznáte, aké sú tu nálady, poznáte odhodlanie.
you know Ukraine from the inside. You are familiar with its sentiment and determination for changes. And after these 4 years since Maidan, do you believe the key all-society change will be successful?
Well, in a country where you have such a vibrant civil society, it's clear that the political events such as election cannot, in my view, reverse the sense of the movement of the country. And therefore, the many progress which have been recorded over the last 4 years in terms of freedom of expression, of freedom of association, in terms of rule of law, all these progress are, in my view, to a large extent irreversible. And therefore, I believe that in the next few years we will see an acceleration of these changes in Ukraine, and Ukraine should be, in the near future, really a country living along European norms and standards, mainly thanks to their civil society, the quality of the people, far more than because of the cooperation they could receive from any partner country.
Keď chodíte po Ukrajine, hovorili ste, že ľudia takí tí bežní.
When you travel around Ukraine, you can see a certain amount of frustration. The risk with these crucial all-society changes is that people support them, but once they get disappointed, they tend to turn to other forces, often radical ones of those from the past. Could this happen to Ukraine?
Obawiam się, że są tutaj miejsca, punkty, w których coś takiego może się wydarzyć.
I fear that there are places where this can happen. If we take a look at Poland, there was a return of nationalism, patriotism. It is strong. And not only in situations that we can see in Ukraine, where there is a bad economic situation, and also a low exchange rate. And although there are reforms, there have been reforms applied on a level from the aspect of people and streets, which is not a European level. We have to say that from Kiev, we cannot see Ukraine well. That is the same in Poland. And in Ukraine, as I said, in the east, of course, I like the words of Mr. Ambassador, who speaks about the necessity of building a new political nation, but that is a place that is pretty much neglected, abandoned. There is a division. No matter what we say, this division exists. It would be an appealing move for the East to take certain measures, to do something. We have got many war veterans who frequently, simply, they are related to extremist movements sometimes. They still meet from time to time. They've got their own structure. In Ukraine, simply, that kind of extremism is even more serious, and we have to take this into consideration. It is even more harmful because it is supported by armed forces. We mustn't ignore this. I suppose that Ukrainian services keep an eye on this, which is right. There was the quick reaction because of Shevchenko, and this also shows that I wouldn't ignore this as a sign. There are people who, just because of their frustration, would like to take certain moves. If there was another Maidan that would be nationalistic, that would lead nowhere, if people don't want to live and work normally, if it comes from that kind of frustration, then Ukraine has to show very concrete, very precise measures on a state level, also in the aspect of society. The role of the European Union is also very important, but as Mr. Minister said, what does Ukraine mean for the European Union? The EU cannot even afford chaos in Ukraine. We cannot afford chaos in Ukraine. This is something that should not be allowed at all. Ukraine is essential. This help must be factual and real. Let me ask you, as someone who knows Ukraine, would you say the transformation into a free country belonging to the West is going to turn out well? In many places, it was already successful. I can say I am satisfied with that. For what you can see in different places, how strong the entrepreneurship of Ukrainians is. We can hear about the Polish, how they could benefit from certain economic changes. So now they are small and medium-sized companies. It is of course stronger in Poland, but I can already see it in Ukraine. Social energy is huge in Ukraine. And also there is the excellent quality of NGOs and of agencies that deal with local politics. These are also things that are excellent because they can foster building society. Of course, there are certain things that we can benefit from, but there are other things that we've already mentioned that simply put pressure on both sides. Mr. Ambassador, you are a diplomat. But please give me an answer that is as realistic as possible. Will Ukraine succeed?
Ukraine has too many assets to fail. They cannot fail. Even with the best will from some politician, they will not manage to fail in their transition towards an open and democratic society based on a social market economy. They have too many assets, they cannot fail.
Pán minister, máte posledné slovo.
Minister, the last question is yours. Imagine it is not the year 2018. Imagine we are in 2028.
Kde bude Ukrajina?
Where will Ukraine be then?
Класне запитання, але насправді
Indeed, this is a good question. Can I modify it somewhat? On what will Ukraine be? This is the most important thing for me. If Ukraine completely gets rid of post-Soviet features, which are still in abundance everywhere, it will be the most important thing for me. In the attitude towards each other, to the rule of law, to Europeanism, and I am absolutely confident in where we'll be. I am sure that we'll be in the European Union and NATO. And then it will come semi-automatically with all the problems of political will, with all the problems of sensitivity and sensitiveness, and so on. Accordingly, the main thing for me is, what will Ukraine be? And if we do not make such a Ukraine about which we were talking, a political nation and a European Ukraine, then we'll be nowhere. Because, in point of fact, Putin will do everything possible to turn our Ukraine into a kind of federation that would function under Russia's control. Thus, it is a question for us. Either we exist or do not exist. And this question is not where we'll be, but the question is what we de facto will be. To that end, I want to become different, so that we are neither post-Soviet nor those who are in the sphere of Russia's influence. That would become true European Ukrainians.
Sedíme na Majdane, v reštaurácii, ktorá sa volá Krym. Bude Ukrajina v roku 2028
We're sitting in Maidan in a restaurant called Crimea. Would Ukraine of 2028 be united?
Хочу бути дуже чесним.
I want to be very honest. I cannot say with 100% certainty, but I'm sure that Crimea, as an occupied part of the Russian reality, goes now nowhere. Well, look, more and more people are very disappointed with what's happening. This is not only the Crimean Tatars. There, in their occupied territory, there are not only Ukrainian, but Russians as well. Because they understand that now all the power is descended on them from Russia. People are descended from Russia, they start not to feel themselves at home. Moreover, among them, there are many of those who initially voted for joining Russia. This process is accelerating now. For this reason, I am sure that Crimea, under the Russian occupation, does not go anywhere. But there are different scenarios. There are time scenarios. There are political scenarios. It would take half an hour for us to come to some conclusion. But I'm confident that Crimea will come back with 100% certainty. And I say this not as a foreign minister, but as an ordinary Ukrainian. Therefore, I believe that Crimea under Russia just does not go anywhere. And where Russia is going, it is a different question, which we can discuss during another program.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Volodymyr, počuli ste?
So, Volodymyr, did you hear our discussion?
First reaction, prvá reakcia.
What is your first reaction?
Було дуже цікаво, і я думаю, що
It was very interesting, and I think that we, the participants, were able to talk about Ukraine and Central Europe and to try and take a look at Ukraine from the point of view of Central Europe, and also a bit on Central Europe from the point of view of Ukraine. We can talk more about this.
Ten jeden rozmer je, že čo môže urobiť Európa, západná Európa, Európska únia.
One dimension is what Western Europe can do,
A druhá otázka je, čo
how
môže
the EU can
Ukrajina
support Ukraine.
zvládnuť v tejto situácii, v ktorej je. Tak začneme to Európskou úniou.
And the other dimension is what Ukraine can achieve in the current situation. Do you believe our support to be sufficient?
Я думаю, що в принципі можемо говорити про те, що чи достатньо є розуміння.
I think that, in general, we can talk about if there is enough understanding about what is going on here in Europe, in the European Union itself. And I think that here, Ukrainian history is unique because we are trying to protect European values and freedoms in a situation when we have an external threat, in a situation when we don't have security guarantees. And this is a unique situation. We often compare Ukraine with Poland, with the Czech Republic, with Hungary, with Slovakia. But this situation is difficult to compare with something else because the country that is threatened usually sacrifices their freedom and their rights, the human rights, and the freedom of expression, in order to respond to the security threat. So the question is whether there is enough understanding in the European Union why this Ukrainian situation is unique. I think we have to work hard from both sides in order to clarify this. The European Union lives in this feeling of security. They feel that security is something guaranteed. Ukraine faces a situation when security is not guaranteed and it has to be defended. So Ukraine is asking the Western world to help to defend its security. And we cannot say that we receive sufficient support here. Ukraine is in the unique situation where, yes, it should rely on some outside support, but it needs to defend itself. And when it has to protect itself, and at the same time it has to protect the democratic values, this is that choice between security and freedom that is very hard to make. So for me, it's very important that this difficult Ukrainian choice would be understood better.
Potrebovala by Ukrajina od Európskej únie niečo ako Marshallov plán?
Does Ukraine need something like the Marshall Plan from the EU?
Я думаю, що тут треба говорити навіть не про там порівняння з Маршалом.
I think that here we should talk not about some comparison with the Marshall Plan, etc. We need to talk about the fact that the association agreement, despite that it is very important, it is not sufficient now because the association agreement is something that brings Ukraine to the common European market. But this is more of something that will have results in the future, something that creates very important rules of the game for Ukrainian business and so on. But we face, and some guests mentioned it here, we face the fact that because of trade war, the hot war, the Ukrainian citizens get poorer. So we are speaking about the reforms, and some of them are successful, but the citizens become poorer because of the devaluation of the hryvnia, because of the economic crisis in 2015 and 2016, and so on. Here, it is very important to understand, both for Ukraine and the EU, that we cannot follow just some classical model that European countries followed. We need to get the Ukrainian citizens out of this economic crisis because we really are facing a new poverty and people don't have money to pay for their apartments and so on. So here really we need to think whether that would be about the Marshall Plan or maybe about better investments, more investments. The issue of creating new jobs in Ukraine, not just creating European rules, but also creating new jobs, is very important.
Tá druhá dôležitá stránka tohto problému je to, čo robíte vy tu na Ukrajine.
The important other side of the issue is what you, Ukrainians, are doing. There was a Polish writer who travels around Ukraine and notices that outside Kiev, People tend to get frustrated by what is happening and what has not been achieved. Perhaps they have had illusions, but some of them got disappointed. You, as a journalist, if you look at the results achieved and those things not achieved in those last 4 years, are you rather satisfied or frustrated?
Я би погодився з міністром Клімкіним, який дуже добре сказав, що Україні
I would agree with Minister Klimkin, who said very well that Ukraine managed to get out of something, but it does not mean that we got somewhere. Ukraine managed well to show that it is not Russia, that it is not an autocratic country that builds its vertical pyramid. However, we're still looking for an answer that's okay. We're not Russia, but who are we? This is an important question for society, whether I am more frustrated or not. I think the frustration and disappointment is something we cannot afford, that we cannot allow ourselves to have. So if there is a threat to your security, you cannot allow yourself to be tired and disappointed. Are there disappointed people and a disappointed society? Of course, yes. And we need to understand that we have elections upcoming in 2019. And quite often, we take a look at the government in Ukraine and consider if it is as it was expected or it is not. But we need to prepare ourselves for the idea that the next government will be worse, that the next parliament will be worse. It will be more divided, there will be many more populists, and there will be much more anti-European rhetoric present. So when we take a look back at Maidan and that path we went through, it could have been better, but it could have been worse. However, the time that we expect up to 2019 could be even more complicated.
Čo je najťažšia vec, ktorou sa Ukrajina za tie 4 roky borí a
What is the hardest thing that Ukraine has been struggling with in these 4 years and hasn't been sorted out yet? Perhaps the toughest problem this government is facing.
You mean the Russian aggression?
No, internally. In Ukrainian politics. Čo je najväčší problém, ktorý táto vláda a táto garnitúra
Internally, in Ukrainian politics, what is the biggest challenge this government has not managed?
Я би сказав, що їх 3. І це те, що відрізняє Україну від Центральної Європи. Перше, це те, що в Центральній Європі
I would say there are 3 of them. And this is something that makes Ukraine different from Central Europe. First is that in Central Europe, the Western European ideas came when socialism was falling apart, and they did not have much resistance. Ukraine went through another path within the last 20 years because the Western world did not come to Ukraine the way it happened in Czech Republic or Slovakia or Poland, etc. And the economy was privatized by internal forces, party forces, and criminal forces. This is the answer why we have such powerful corruption in Ukraine and why it has so much resistance to reforms in Ukraine, because it is so strong economically. So we cannot compare Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary in 1989 and Ukraine of 2014. These are 2 different realities. And of course, this is a problem that has to be overcome in years because it is oligarchic business which has very deep roots here. This was the first problem. And the second problem is the issue of identity. We also talked about whether Ukraine is building an ethnic nation or a political nation. Again, we have a difference with Central Europe because here, not a single project of ethnic nation would work. In our country, we have many languages, we have many religions, and if we're talking about a third of its territory, until the 17th century, 1/3 of the Ukrainian territory was Turkic tribes. Or this was the Crimean Tatars, not just in Crimea, but also in the south. So it's a big challenge, and it's very interesting. And it's not typical for Central Europe to build a political nation out of different mosaic elements. And I'd say that here society and Ukrainian government are just trying to find a way. And the third thing I mentioned here is how to protect the liberal values when your security is being threatened. When the enemy can use those liberal values against you, for example, create some puppet media that disseminates propaganda together under the mask of the freedom of speech. Here in Ukraine, we have to navigate between Scylla and Charybdis. Have we managed to do this? I would say no. But concerning the situation we face, I don't know where we can look for the model. We need to invent this model ourselves.
Čo je najväčší úspech garnitúry, ktorá prišla po Majdane?
What is the government's greatest success after Maidan?
Найбільший успіх, мені здається, в тому, що їх знову
The biggest success, I'd say, again, we have two of them. The first success is that there was really a moment of independence. And that's why it's so difficult to protect this independence. Russia is leading the war for the first time, not just against Ukraine, the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian rebels, because that happened before. But it leads the war against Kiev. Kiev, which is a very important city for Russia. And this is an example of how painful it is for the empire, and that it is really a war for independence. The second positive result is that if we compare it to the Orange Revolution 10 years ago, this time Ukrainians did not create some gods out of the politicians. They said, okay, politicians are good, we give them some trust, but we will do everything ourselves. So I think that this is the most important success that will continue working for a long time.
Vy ste novinár, tak vy nemusíte byť ani optimista, ani pesimista.
As a journalist, you don't need to choose between being an optimist and pessimist. If you look several years to the future, where do you see Kiev?
Для мене найважливіше це те, щоб
the most important thing is that Ukraine does not fall victim to this disappointment. Disappointment always follows. This is the fate of revolutions. They either end with disappointment or dictatorship. And disappointment is not the worst development for some revolutionary events. But the energy that we had at that time, it still continues, and it's important for it to provide results. So this is what is very important to me. If in 2 years we do not have society, that would be completely disappointing. It is really a good thing. Thank you.